Hi, this is Bob from INSYDIUM, and this is part 2 of our particle Christmas tree tutorial series. In this video, we're going to look at our second simulation technique. Remember, there's 3 in total. This one will take some linear flow field simulations, and we're going to deform those particles to wrap around our helix splines. So here we are in the scene that we left off from the last video, and we've got our flow spline system here with this really nice animation. But we're going to move on and do a different technique. So let's deactivate this flow spline system and let's just make it all invisible. So we're not going to be looking at that. We can leave that alone for the time being. So our next technique is going to be using we're going to be creating this kind of more flattened ribbon of particles, and we're only going to be using one of our helix splines. So let's just open our null, and we don't need the outer one for now, and we don't need the inner. We're just going to be using this mid spline, and we're going to get our ribbon of particles to move along it, and we're going to get snow particles, light particles, and our Christmas baubles. So let's get this started, and actually what we're going to do is just move the camera over here. And we're going to start this by bringing in a cube, and you'll understand why we do that in a sec. So let's bring in a cube primitive, and the cube primitive, we want to make it not very tall. So let's go to the object tab, and in the Y, let's put this down at maybe 15 centimeters. Okay, that's looking good. And then we want to make this about, at the moment, it's 200 centimeters wide on the X. Let's try 120. And then on the Z, we want this to be really, really long. So I'm going to guess at 1500, but we might need to make it longer. Let's maybe try 2000. Okay, and then what we're going to do is move it, so it's 2000 in the Z. Let's go to our coordinates and move it 1000 in the Z axis, and there it starts at our 0 Z point now. Excellent. Right, so there is our cube. Now, you can see that our cube doesn't have much geometry at the moment, and we only have one segment on each axis. So in the Z, let's put loads. Let's put this on, say, 60. That's not enough. Let's put it on 150. Right, loads of segments. In the X, we don't need as many, obviously, because it's not very wide. Let's try 15. And now I've seen that, I'm just going to make the Z segments 200. And then let's just give it a couple in the Y. All right, so now we've got loads more geometry in our cube. And what we're able to do with this cube is we can wrap this around this spline like a ribbon, and that's the effect that we want. So the way we do that is with a deformer. So let's go to our deformers menu here, and what we want is a SplineWrap. Let's bring that in. And you'll see, look, we've got this domain of the SplineWrap and an arrow. So what we need to do is we need to make this a child of the object that we want to deform. So let's make it a child of the cube. And you'll see automatically, look, that bounding box has fit the cube. But look, the arrow is pointing in this direction, in the plus X, which means it's going to try and wrap it round the wrong way. We want the arrow to be pointing this way in the plus Z. So to change that, look, if we go to our SplineWrap, yes, we can see, look, the axis is set to plus X, which is not what we want. We want plus Z. So if we put plus Z, that arrow now changes along this length. And now when we tell it to wrap around our spline, let's do that. Look, it's asking for a spline here. So let's put in our helix mid. Now it is wrapping around that spline. Now the banking and the twisting is a bit off. We want this to be flat, but we're getting the basic effect. So how do we sort out this banking that's not right? Well, first of all, let's just make ourselves a bit of room here. We can go to the size. Actually, we'll do size in a moment. Let's do rotation. And the rotation, if we move this is the length of our spline from the beginning of the spline at the bottom to the end of the spline at the top. And look, we're able to rotate it. Now that has flattened it out perfectly at the bottom, but it's still rotating as it gets to the top. So what we need to do is flatten it more but then bring this handle down, and you'll see, look, we're starting to get it being flattened all the way. So something like that is looking really good. Okay, so that's looking good. So now we've done that, let's close up the rotation. Now in the size, this will dictate the width of our geometry going up the spline. So again, this is the start of the spline, and this is the end of the spline, and this is the width of our geometry. So at the moment it has 100% width all the way along the spline. But if we start bringing this down, you'll see it'll start to narrow as it gets to the point, which is what we want. So we want maybe something like, we want it to be quite fat at the bottom, maybe something like that. So that is looking very nice indeed. And we could even have this really going to a point by the time it gets to the top. Let's hit NA to hide these lines, NA. And there we go. Look, we have perfectly got that object, and this hasn't moved the object. If we switch the SplineWrap off, we just still have our cube in the position where it was, but we've deformed it to wrap around this spline. So that's working excellently. So why are we doing this? But we're working with particles. We don't want to work with cubes. Well, all will become clear. So what we're going to do is, let's just switch off the SplineWrap for now. And what we want to do is we're going to emit particles so they follow this exact path and they are within this exact volume. And then what we're going to do is deform the particles to do the same thing that this geometry is doing. So let's look at getting that set up. So what we'll do is, let's just organize our hierarchy here. So we'll just collapse our splines for now, and we'll also collapse our cube. Let's bring in a new xParticles system for this SplineWrap setup. So we'll go to INSYDIUM, xParticles system. The new system, let's rename it straight away. We'll call it SplineWrap. And we'll just change the icon so it's a different color to our existing system. We'll go to Object, Icon Color. Let's just change that to an orange. All right. Excellent. Right, so we'll bring our new system to the bottom. We'll bring our cube below it. And that's looking good for now. Right, so we're ready to get going. So in our new system, let's just open this up. We'll give ourselves a little bit of room. So our new system, we have brought in an XP emitter here, and if we hit play, we can see our emitter firing these particles in the plus Z, looking good. Let's just change the display of these immediately. So we'll go to our emitter, we'll go to our display settings, and let's change it from editor display squares to dots, and let's give them a gradient parameter. We'll just leave that blue to white gradient, and we'll map that gradient to the I'll just leave it on particle age for now. So now we've got the same setup where the particles are born blue and they gradually get white. And we'll just go to the emitter, emission, and instead of the birth rate being on the default 1,000 per second, let's put that on, I don't know, just 10,000 per second for now. Okay, good. So what we need to do is position our emitter so it's in the same position as our cube and the bounds of our SplineWrap object. If we just click that on, look there, we can see the bounds. Okay, so let's do that. Let's go to our cube first. Go to the coordinates, and we can see that in the X, it's on minus, let's put this on a round number. At the moment, it's minus 642. Let's change that to minus 650, just to make it a round number. And then we can go to our emitter, and let's go to the coordinates, and on the X, let's put minus 650. Perfect. And then we just need to adjust the height of our emitter so it fits inside our box, something like that, and we can make it a bit wider. There we go. Perfect. And what we want to do is when we hit play, we want our particles to be trapped inside. Let's just make the box invisible. We want them to be trapped inside. So if we just demonstrate that they're not trapped inside, if we bring in a modifier, let's go to the Object tab, Motion Modifier, let's choose turbulence, hit play, and those particles are now being moved around by the turbulence and obviously escaping the confines of our cube. So we want them to collide inside that cube. So let's go to the cube, let's go to the tags, extensions, INSYDIUM, xParticles collider tag. It appears on our cube. And then in the settings for that, we need the normals to be inside. We want it to bounce on the inside of our cube. So now if we hit play, particles are emitted. They're being moved by the turbulence, but they're trapped inside the confines of our cube. So that's pretty cool. We're not going to be actually using this setup, but at the moment the turbulence is moving those particles around on the Y, the X and the Z axis, and it's kind of inhibiting a lot of their forwards motion. So let's just go to our turbulence and switch off the power on the Z axis, and let's go to our emitter and give them more speed. So we'll do that in the emission tab. Let's give them a speed of, I don't know, 500. So now they're going to be moving forward pretty quick, but the turbulence is blowing them around the place. All right, that's looking pretty cool. Let's just change this display mode so it's not on age as well. Let's go to the emitter display, and instead of mapping that gradient to the age, let's map it to the speed of the particles, and let's just hit auto. And this will automatically make the slowest particles blue and the fastest particles white. So now if we hit play, there we go. There are our particles. Okay, so now we have our particles moving in exactly the same way as our cube. They're contained within our cube. So now what we want to do is we want to wrap the particles around this spline. So the way in which we're going to do that is, the problem that we have is, if we activate our SplineWrap and view the cube, we're now wrapping our collider object around this spline. So if we hit play, our particles are no longer being contained within that cube. And that's a problem, because if we go and set up this SplineWrap to affect the position of our particles as well, which we can, let's go to the emitter, to the modifiers tab. So in this modifiers tab, it's not just xParticles modifiers we can put in here, we can put deformers in as well. So look, if we put our SplineWrap deformer in the emitter and hit play, you'll see that, look, it's emitting and wrapping those particles around our spline, but they're not being contained within our cube. Why not? Well, that's because, in actual fact, our particles are still being emitted from here, and they're just being deformed into this position, but we've moved that collision geometry that was keeping them within the cube. So what we need to do is, we need our collision geometry not to be deformed by the SplineWrap. So the way we can do that is, look, let's just get this cube, hold control and make a duplicate. So now we have two. In the original one, let's remove the collision tag, just take that off. And in the new one, let's remove the SplineWrap. So now we have a copy of a cube with a collision tag, which is always going to be in this position, and this is our collision geometry. So then we can make this one invisible. We can make this one invisible, we don't need to see it, but now you will see, if we simulate, that our particles will be perfectly kept, despite the turbulence, will be perfectly kept within that cube, meaning we're getting this perfectly flat plane of particles moving up our spline. And the reason that we kind of made copies and we kept this original cube active is, it's just very important that our SplineWrap has these bounds that are exactly the same as the cube. And sometimes if you start moving the SplineWrap around into different positions within your hierarchy, it can alter those automated bounds. And if these get enlarged, if they take on the bounds of a null or another object, it's going to destroy our illusion. So we've kept our original cube with the SplineWrap active, just to make sure that the SplineWrap always has the correct bounds. And then we've made our new cube collision geometry in exactly the same place as those bounds, which means that our particles are always going to be contained within it, which means we keep our thin ribbon of particles. So that's the basic technique about how we deform these particles, but this turbulent movement doesn't look very good. This isn't how we're going to achieve the look of these swirling around our splines. So that is what we need to get set up now. And the way in which we're going to get this movement is we're going to be using our turbulence, but we're going to use this as a secondary force, really. So let's just switch that off for now. And we'll also switch off our SplineWrap, so our particles are just contained within our invisible cube here, so we can see what's happening with their motion. Now, the way in which we're going to get them to move is with an xpFlowField, which is going to give us a custom velocity field. So let's go to our dynamics. We'll go to the objects and we'll choose an xpFlowField. So this is our flow field object, and it creates this velocity field within this orange bounds. And by default, the velocity field is set to be a random one. And we can see with these velocity vectors, these trail displays here, we can see that kind of random movement that the particles will get. So what we need to do is, first of all, we can delete this random layer. If we go to our flow field object tab, you can see that by default we have a random layer here, which is giving us these random velocities. Let's just delete that. We don't need those. What we do need to do is make sure that our bounds of our flow field are in the same part of our viewport as our cube. So what we could do is, look, let's just go to our cube and remind ourselves of its dimensions. So 120 on the x by 15 on the y by 2000. So let's go to our flow field, and in the bounds we want, what was it, 150 on the x, 15 on the y, and 2000 on the z. So now we have the same dimensions and we want it to be in the same position. So let's go to our coordinates, and the z needs to be 1000 and the x was, what was it, minus 650. So now our flow field is in the same position and is the same size exactly as our cube. So let's do a couple of things. Let's just make sure that it's a little bit taller, to make sure that it's definitely encasing our cube, a little bit wider, so we can do something like that. And now what we'll do right at the very end, we're going to make our flow field in fact, no, let's just leave it, we'll leave it as is for now, but we are actually going to make it slightly shorter, but we'll leave that step until a little bit later. All right, so now we've got this domain set up, but there's no custom velocities created yet because we haven't got any layers. So let's go to our flow field object tab, and what we want to do is, we don't want a random layer, we want to create a force field which is always forcing the particles to be kind of moving towards the center of our flow field domain. And we're going to get the turbulence to push them away from the center, but then the force field to kind of bring them back into the center. That's going to give us a swirling motion. So the way we're going to do that is by using a spline. So we want a spline to run all the way down the center of our flow field domain. So the way in which we'll set that up is, we want to go to the top view. So if we hit F5 on our keyboards, we'll get all of our views. We were looking at this one, perspective, but look, we have got right-hand view, front view, and top view. So we want to look at the top down. So let's press this button, which will make the top view, it'll maximize it in our viewport. And now we're looking at the top down at our flow field domain here. So now in this view, we can draw a spline all the way down here. Now we don't want this spline to be perfectly straight. You don't want a linear spline. We want it to be a bit wobbly. So we'll just draw it freehand. So to do that, we'll go to our spline tool options, click and hold, and we've got various options. We want to pick sketch. So let's let go there. And now I'm doing this with a mouse, and so this is going to be really wobbly and awful, but you'd have a bit more control if you did this with a pen and a tablet. But look, let's click and hold. Let's draw this spline. We've got a few bumps and wobbles here and there, but that's looking all right. So now if we hit F1 to go back to perspective view, and look, we have this spline in the middle that has some wobbles, which is going to look pretty good. Okay, so now let's just take off that spline tool. So let's just organize this. So here is our new spline that we've made. So let's go to the basic tab and call that SplineFlowField, so we know what it is, and we'll just drag it into our utilities folder. There we go. And we could also put, look, our cube and our cube SplineWrap into our utilities folder as well, so we can keep totally organized. Okay, so let's go to our flow field. We want to use this spline to create some velocity information. So let's go to our object, and what we need is, if we go to our add layers here, we don't want a random, that's what came in as default, but look at all these different layers that we could use. We're going to use a 2 spline layer. So let's bring that in. And now we need to say, which spline do you want me to use? So let's move down to these layer options. Here they are. And we can drag in which spline we want to use. So let's get our spline flow field, drag it in here. And if we go at the moment, now look, you can see, look, there is our single plane of velocity vectors, and it's displaying these, and they're all going towards this spline. But this force field is exists within this entire volume. So to display that, let's go to the display tab. Look, we've got the mode set to trails, which gives us these lines, and we've got just XY plane. If we put voxels, it's going to show the whole grid of velocities. There, look. So everywhere within this, we've got these lines forcing the particles to go towards that spline. And you'll see that they're not perfectly hugging the spline. They seem a little bit offset. And that's just because we don't have the resolution in our grid. If we go to the Object tab, look, we have the cell size set to 30 centimeters. So it's not a very accurate grid. If we reduce this way down to say 15, it's going to be much more accurate, loads more cells, and it's going to be hugging that spline much more closely, but it's got to make more calculations, and we may not need that detail. So let's just put that back to the default 30. Let's hide the display of our vectors. Let's go to the display. Let's just put show vectors, switch that off for now, and what we need to do is hit play. And now you can see that our particles are being affected by this to a certain degree, but it doesn't look perfect, does it? Look, these ones here are kind of going off straight, and then they're only just going towards the spline. There's a whole stripe of particles here that seem to be completely ignoring the flow field. So what's going on? Well, this is happening because by default there is a fall-off setup, which means that the power of this force field is stronger at the spline, and as the particles get further away from the spline, there's less force. And we can actually visualize that if we go back to our display mode, switch those vectors back on, change the mode from trail to, let's put it on arrows. And now can you see, look, the arrows that are nearer the spline are yellow, so it's strong, and as they fall off from that spline, they're turning green to blue to then dark blue, where there's no strength at all. And that's why the particles that were down here weren't being affected by it. Look, let's hit play. These ones aren't getting any force towards that spline whatsoever. So if we switch, go back to our flow field object, let's go back to our spline, our 2 spline layer, and look, we have this fall off automatically switched on. And so right at the spline it has full strength, and as it falls off away from the spline it goes down to 0 strength. So if we just switch this off, there's the same strength throughout the entire domain. If we go back to our display, turn those vectors off, now every particle is moving along that spline. Now we're getting a bit of weird movement here. Look, we're getting these ones that are bouncing and coming back, so this isn't looking right. Now one of the problems we have here is nothing to do with the flow field, it's to do with our emitter and our collision cube. And our emitter is in the exact position of our collision cube, and so the initial burst of particles is not coming out smoothly. We need the emitter to be slightly inside that cube. So we could just move it ever so slightly in, and now we're going to get much better flow of particles. There we go. So there was a collision calculation as soon as those particles were being born, which was messing things up. Now we haven't got that. The particles are moving far too quickly. So let's go to our emitter, to our emission tab, and let's slow these down. Let's just say 300 so we can make them slower. All right, now our flow field at the moment is pulling those particles towards the spline, and it's too strong. This force is too strong. So let's go to our flow field object, to the object tab, and we have a strength of 10%. Look, let's just put this way down to say just 2%. So now we're starting to get an interesting pulsing kind of rhythm look. So that's looking good. Let's also, with our collision, every time our particles are hitting the side of our cube, let's see, where is it? We have just the default settings in this. And look, we have a friction amount and we have a bounce amount, which are altering the path of our particles. We just want them to be trapped within the cube, and we don't want it to cause any bounce or friction. So let's just take all of that off. All right. So this is looking good. So now we have got this. Once our particles get to the end of our cube, we want them to die really, but they're not. They're bouncing off it, and they're kind of just staying in this position. Look, they're just building up, and we've got loads of particles in the scene that we just don't really need. So what we actually want is for these particles, when they get to the end, just to die. So we can set that up with the flow field. Let's make sure that our flow field object is slightly shorter than our cube. Now at the moment it's exactly the same dimensions as our cube, but if we just make it slightly shorter like this, you'll see that our particles, when they come to the end, they'll come outside of our flow field boundary, and then they'll hit the cube. Yeah, so they're hitting the cube, look, outside of that flow field boundary. So what we want to do is set up a system that says when they get outside of the flow field, kill the particles off. And that's dead easy to set up. We'll just go to our flow field, to the object tab, and look, we're in general at the moment, but we can go to the actions, and we have, look, actions on escape. So when a particle escapes the flow field bounds, do something. So let's add an action. And the action that we want is, we want other actions. We want to direct action. And the direct action we don't want to change geometry. These are all the direct choices. And we want, look, we could change the speed of the particle. We could explode the particles. There's loads of stuff we could do, but we want to change the life of the particles. Let's click on that. And then if we move down, you'll see, look, we have action, change life, direct change, and we just leave this as default, look, because the parameters to change, it's going to kill the particles. So now we've got that going. If we play this, when the particles get to the end of our flow field, they'll die. Let's just move this further down here so we can see it, obviously. And yep, look, they come to the end and they have died. So we'll just extend that flow field out a bit more so it's closer to the edge of our cube. Great. So now we have done that. We're not needlessly calculating particles to live longer than is necessary, and we can maybe add a little bit of turbulence back now. So let's go to our turbulence mod. We'll activate it, and this is going to just give us a little bit of different movement within our scene. Let's reduce the scale of this turbulence to maybe 20. Let's give this some Z-axis movement as well. So remember, we switched that off when we were initially setting this up, so the turbulence wasn't affecting the particles on the Z, but now we've got our flow field set up correctly. That's going to work nicely for us. Yep, this is looking good. We could reduce, we don't need the turbulence to be animating itself as much, so let's just reduce that. So now we're getting a pretty interesting flow of particles. So that's looking pretty good. Let's just go back to our Christmas tree then, and we can go to our cube that contains our SplineWrap, Let's reactivate the SplineWrap, and now we have got the animation that we were going for. We've got our particles making our way up the tree. They are kind of swirling around and giving us some nice motion, but they are remaining really thin like ribbons. So that's what we want. And we just need to, we're killing those particles off just before they get to the end of this spline. That's just the way in which we clipped that flow field. So what we could do, we could actually help these move towards the end of the spline by adjusting a SplineWrap setting. Look, we can, the end mode is set to extend. And that means that if we increase this 2 parameter beyond 100%, look, it's gone a little bit further up our spline, put it on 102, and now it's extended off the top, and that's kind of filled out that spline somewhat. So let's animate that through. We've got particles going up in our ribbons all the way to the top, and then dying at the top. So that's looking excellent. All right, so now that we've got that, we could start looking at setting up a render for these snow ones. And we also need to think about the different elements here, because we need snow particles, which these will be, but we also need light particles, the illumination particles, those Christmas lights, and we need to work out the Christmas bauble particles as well. So in fact, let's get those baubles sorted first. So we have our emitter here, which is our snow. So let's just change that in the basic tab of the emitter. We'll change the name from emitter and we'll just put snow as a suffix. And then what we're going to do is we want our baubles. So let's just hold control, drag this down, and now we've got a copy. This one, we'll change the name of that one. Baubles. There we go. And let's just switch off our snow emitter for now. So in the baubles one, obviously we need far fewer. We need hardly any of these. We definitely don't need 10,000 per second. So let's just put this maybe down to 10. And although our baubles are going to be much bigger, we'll just keep the radius the same, and we'll control how big our baubles are using the instance tag in Cycles 4D later on. So we'll just leave it at this for now. So now if we hit play, we've got far fewer particles in our scene. It's very difficult to see them. So let's go to our emitter baubles display tab, and we'll change the editor display from dots to circles filled. And then let's just give them, instead of a gradient parameter, let's just give them a gradient random, and we will just change. So now it's just randomly going to assign the particles any color from on this gradient. So let's just change these. We'll keep one blue. We'll make one like an orange color, and we'll make one a full red, something like that. And then we could get rid of that white one. Let's select all those knots. Let's hit step. All right, and in the display, just so we can see these baubles a bit more clearly, we're going to keep the particle radius the same. So if we hit play, now we've got 3 centimeter baubles in our tree. But if we want to just make these look bigger, we can just go in the display tab of the emitter to the display size factor and just increase this and stick them way up. Okay. So they're looking good, but one thing we're going to have a problem with here is that when these get to the top, they need to scale down before they die. They're just staying the same size. So we need these to scale down over their journey. So the way we'll do that is we'll do it with a modifier, and we're going to do it with data mapping. So let's go to the modifiers. Let's go to our control modifiers, and we'll pick a XP scale. And this one, we are just actually not going to change value over time. This is going to make them gradually get bigger and bigger and bigger over time, which is not what we want. We want them to get smaller as they get towards the top of the tree. So the way we're going to do it is this. We're going to set the particle radius to just be one value. So look, set value. And we're going to make the particle radius 3 centimeters. This is exactly the same as it was set in the emitter. So this is going to look no different. But then we're going to map this radius value to how far the particles have traveled. So the further they've traveled, the less of this radius value they're going to get. So to do that, let's go to our mapping tab. We'll add a map. And the parameter that we want to map, these parameters here are all parameters that are in our object tab. All of these parameters. We want radius value. That's what we want to map. So let's go back to our map, to our parameter, and let's look for, there it is, radius value. So we'll do that. Okay, and then we want to map this to how far the particles have traveled. So let's go to the map to list, and we're looking for, look there, look, distance traveled. Okay, and we know these particles, it looks like they're traveling around our spline, but in actual fact they're traveling across this in this kind of more linear direction, and we know that this is 2,000 centimeters, our cube. So we can put 2,000 centimeters here. So now what this default curve is saying is when the particles have traveled no distance at all, they will have 0% of their radius value. So they'll have no radius. And as they travel further, they'll get more and more of the radius value until it gets up to the maximum of 3. So let's see it. They should be born really tiny. Can't see them. Look, yeah, and they're gradually, as they travel further, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So our mapping is working, but we need to reverse it. We want them to be born with full radius value. We want them, when they've reached the end of their journey, to have no radius value, and we're going to want this curve to kind of fall off quite abruptly like this. So let's have a look. They should have their full size. Good. And then as they travel, they should get smaller, and then they come and they disappear by the time they die. Perfect. And we could move this across so they're scaling down more quickly, but we don't want that. So I think that's looking pretty decent. Excellent. So that is working. We've managed to map the size of those particles so they're scaling down as they travel around our tree. So that's working great. And that's also going to work well for our snow particles, because we actually want them to kind of almost disappear as they reach the top. So this scale will be affecting both our baubles and our snow particles. Excellent. Right, so we've done our baubles, we've done our snow. Now we want our Christmas lights particles. So let's get our emitter snow one again. Hold Control, make a copy. This one, let's go to the basic tab and we'll rename it. This is going to be lights. And again, we need far fewer than the snow. So let's go to the lights emission tab. We don't need 10,000 per second. I'm saying we'll try maybe 200. These ones, we don't want the lights to scale down as they get to the top. We want the lights to remain the same, which will give us an interesting effect in our final render. So we don't want our emitter lights to be affected by that scale modifier that we just set up. So to do that, let's go to the emitter lights, to the modifiers tab. We'll drag in the scale and make sure that this is a minus, so it's not going to affect these particles. Okay, so then let's activate all of those emitters. Let's hit play, simulate, and now we have got bauble particles, we've got snow particles, and we've got lights particles. The snow and the baubles are scaling down as they get to the top, and the lights aren't. Now, one thing that's immediately obvious with this is that it's moving far too quickly, this simulation. And if we start messing around with the particle's speed, the force, the flow field and the turbulence is going to be massively changed. So the way in which we're going to slow these particles down is it's a two-step process. We're still going to have to slightly adjust our flow field and our turbulence, but we're going to do it in the emitters. Let's select all of them. Let's go to the Object tab, and what we're able to do is adjust the retiming. It's 100% by default. If we put this down to, let's say, 60%, all of these particles are going to be moving far more slowly, and the forces are generally the same. However, we are going to have to slightly adjust our flow field strength and our turbulence strength just to reduce it a little, because they're moving more slowly now. So let's go to our flow field. Let's go to our strength. This is our global strength, and put it down to, say, 1.2. So we've almost half the strength. Then let's go to our turbulence, and again the strength, let's almost half it. Let's put this on, say, 2.7. So now we're going to have pretty much the same kind of particle movement that we had before, but we've just slowed it down a bit, and that's going to look much better in our render. Excellent. So we've got all of our particles sorted, the 3 different types. We've got them scaling down where necessary. Now we need to start setting up this scene so we can get these particles rendering, and that's what we will approach in our next video.